I'm very excited to introduce you to Rachel Bonnell, who is a climate corruption journalist. And probably many of you know her from her podcast, Planet Critical, where she interviews a lot of excellent people, scientists, activists, all sorts of people, on the topic of climate or like general the crises that we face. I think you have like 35,000 subscribers and like all over the world, which is really beautiful and insane. I'm personally also a listener. You've accompanied me on several runs. Actually, I do like sing on the weekend where I go for a run in the morning. I'm out in beautiful nature and I try to have some food for thought. You're often accompanying me in that. And I think what I personally actually really like about Rachel is like, I think one, you share your emotions, how you're feeling, which oftentimes very frustrating, but also you have like this insane knowledge on all these different aspects, and you're actually able to discuss properly with these different experts, which is really, really impressive because they are experts on the topic, but you somehow find the time to dive into every one of them and like have this deep discussion, which is very impressive. You recently also did like a traveling around the world, visiting indigenous people, which I'm also very curious to hear. So yeah, hopefully you're welcoming, Rachel.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here with you all. And thank you to both Fabian and Caroline for organizing this and everyone else who's behind the scenes organizing this. So Fabian asked me last night to introduce myself a little bit further as well, particularly this filming project that we were doing. So I've been running Planet Critical for 5.5 years. And about 4 years into it, I felt, I feel like I can answer the question, why is the world in crisis, which is what I'd set out to do. And I cannot answer the question, what do we do about it? When people ask me at conferences or on panels or in marches. And that seems like a really, really big problem to have this like huge knowledge set, this diagnosis, but not really have a treatment plan. And so my partner and I, we launched Planet Coordinate. And that was investigating what to do for a world in crisis. And so we traveled around, I sort of sent out this big announcement to my entire network and said, hello, we're going to make guerrilla documentaries or something. Do you know anybody who's doing something really interesting that we could come and film? And we wanted to focus on the majority world. And I'm sure most of you know that term, but for any of you who don't, it's the term I prefer to use rather than the global south, because the majority of people live there. And I think it's just more politically reflective of the situation. So we wanted to focus on the majority world because, quite frankly, a huge number of communities in the majority world, entire populations even, have gone through existential crisis very recently because of colonization or because of globalization. And it seems to me that the people who have lived through that and battled against it and defended themselves against it are probably in a better position to answer the question, what do we do when facing an existential threat, than us Europeans, who quite frankly haven't really faced anything like that since the Black Death, or something like that. So we ended up in Colombia, and we were working with this community who were extraordinary. They're in one of the most biodiverse hotspots in the world, between the Andes and some other part, I can't really remember, but it's very ecologically important. And they are fighting off one of the biggest mining companies in the world. And they've been fighting off this company for 20 years, right? And what they've done really is quite incredible. I mean, it was essentially the farmers launched this first line of defense through nonviolent action for about a decade, 10 to 15 years. And then afterwards, they got more of the community stakeholders involved because they realized they couldn't just keep resisting in this manner because eventually they would be crushed, right? The company was buying their way into local politics, buying their way into the church, buying their way into schools, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same playbook that we've seen around the world. And so what they realized they needed was a vision for what they could have instead. Right? If the mining company doesn't come, here's what we could do instead with our land. Here's what we could do instead with our communities. And it really, I would say, changed at that moment the nature of my work and my thoughts, seeing that in action, understanding just how deeply and witnessing how deeply these people belonged to what they called their territoria, the land, the environment, which is not just the mountains, but also all of the species. It's essentially quite a political word to represent how fundamentally intertwined they are with where they come from. And we're using that to actually do these really politically and economically innovative little schemes on a local context, which were working. So, for example, they created a local shop so that farmers could sell higher priced organically farmed cocoa from the mountains, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to transition to that model, because if there was nowhere to put the produce, there was nowhere to make any money from it. And then they put out campaigns essentially for anybody who wants to keep resisting this mine, this is now a new way that you can do it. They created participatory education programs in the high school. They got the university involved. Fucking president of Colombia came down to visit because they were doing such important work, Gustavo Petro. And it was just incredibly inspiring for me. And it sort of made very clear this idea that the work that you're all doing, and the work the people I interview are doing, it's not just a scientific problem or an economic problem or a political problem. It's very much a physical problem. It's a material problem, and it begins in our bodies. How is it that we defend where we are? How is it that we live where we are? How is it that we build relationships with one another? How is it that we protect those relationships? And how is it that we can feel what is happening on a global scale in here as well? And I don't just mean that on a spiritual level, but I do mean it really on a physical level in our nervous systems. Because if we don't begin to feel it in here, it will one day be felt there when this crisis comes to meet our shore. And Europe, the United States, the minority world essentially can no longer just throw technocratic solutions at a problem that is really, truly existential, political, and almost as old in nature as the imperial core is itself. Are we all with me? Yeah. Okay, great. So that set me off just to frame today what I want to be talking to you about. Just to signpost slightly, we're going to get to feminism essentially, which I think is incredibly important when discussing what I call the eco crisis. That's the prefix that I use rather than climate or biodiversity. Eco meaning, of course, both economic and ecological, coming from the Greek ekos, which means the household and the management of the household and the people within the household. That's how I like to think about it. So I think responding to the eco crisis is a fundamentally feminist problem. And I'm just going to signpost that that's where we're going here. So being there and witnessing essentially what these people were up against was very, very interesting, because the mining company wanted gold, and they wanted gold from the mountains for the renewable economy. And in the town where the mining office had their big office, where the mining corporation had their big office, they had a slogan above their door, and it said, "For the energy transition." Right? Now we are talking about an indigenous people being displaced by the work that they were doing there, an agrarian community that has been there for 500 years being displaced, the pollution of one of the most important rivers in Colombia, the Cauca River, and the denigration and the erasure of, the political and cultural relationships that have been built up over time in that region for the energy transition. Now, this poses quite a big problem, doesn't it? Because the energy transition is being promoted as the one way that we are going to successfully innovate our way out of this problem, and the way that we are going to maintain our development and our progress and lift people out of poverty. And I know that you already had Julia Steinberger here, who's wonderful, and I'm so glad that she was here before me, because she can do all of this stuff much better. But we don't need as much energy as we have in order to live well, but we do need some. So where are we going to get it from? And who gets to choose, essentially, who is dispossessed in order to make room for that? How can we do that in non-colonial ways? How can we do it in non-violent ways? Can we do it in non-violent ways? And this was the question I sort of felt up against in Colombia, looking at this incredibly, I wish, I don't do slides because but if I had photos, you would see really beautiful mountains. And it just made me realize essentially that there is a slow violence that's going on that is connected as well to the energy transition. And frankly, it's one that we cannot ignore. And the data is there as well, sadly, to support this. There have been papers published that show that the biodiversity crisis that could be triggered by the mining boom just for the renewable energy transition could be worse than the climate crisis that it is trying to mitigate and offset. The majority of new mining projects that are being opened up right now are in biodiverse hotspots, and they are also particularly targeting critical materials that are required for the energy transition. There is a hugely dangerous sort of industrial boom happening in the majority world, in the very few places of pristine ecosystem that we have left. And it's so that we can stop the planet overheating. That doesn't really quite make sense. And of course, when we exist in an economy that is predicated on growth and on profit, when these are our values, then it makes sense actually that this is what's happening, because these lands are the most difficult to defend, perhaps, or the easiest to exploit. It depends how you want to frame it in that way. And so because these lands are the easiest to exploit, that's essentially the ones that are being targeted by this profiteering, growth accumulating machine. And it means that the very things that we are deploying in Europe that look very green and no doubt in many ways are necessary are in fact coming at the expense of communities and of our kinfolk, the species with whom we share this planet all around the world. And if we do not take this seriously, this threat, then I really fear for the future that we are careening towards. And I fear as well politically, essentially, for a world in which in 20 years' time, people that will have come round essentially to green capitalism, perhaps, if that's where we get to, or an eco-conscious future, but one that is built on the promise of unlimited energy. When we come up against the reality that even that is not possible in the context in which we are extracting that energy still from living beings, and our ecosystems are collapsing and we're going to have to do something else, I worry about the reactionary wave even then, and the possible swing to the right that could push even green advocates now. And I think that that's also another threat that we really need to be taking seriously. Are we with me? Okay. I just want to do a meta check-in. Like I hope this is relevant and interesting for at least half, at least half of you. Okay, great. So I want to offer a definition of violence. At this stage, I recognize I'm using the word quite a lot. I define violence as the severing of relationships. And I think that that's relevant to all of you at this Complexity School for Climate Change, because it essentially is a definition that speaks to the simplification of life, right? The simplification or erosion or destruction of life. And I like this definition, and I wrote this definition, and I use the definition because the dictionary definitions only actually talk about violence as being able to occur between human beings, right? Like we cannot inflict violence upon other creatures. Yeah. And also they are limited very much to violence being a physical thing, whereas we can experience emotional violence, spiritual violence, political violence, religious violence. And so I thought it was important essentially to try and find a definition that encompasses our own ecological position in the world and the manifestation of destruction as well that humanity can have across the world. And I also wanted a definition that essentially could be applied politically. You know, if we're thinking about a political question or a scientific question, we can go, does this action that we're about to take, does it create more relationships? Does it complexify life? Or does it erode, degrade, or sever relationships, i.e., is it violent? And where is that happening? Does it complexify relationships here and erode them over here? Do we then get into a question of net violence? Maybe have a cryptocurrency for violence where people can, you know, buy the credits in order to create destruction somewhere else? I don't know. But I do think that this is important. Because I think also it then begins to frame the problem that we're facing as a question of, as a reality of experiencing violence every single day in our world, and also actively participating in violent actions around the world through our dependence on certain political structures or technological solutions. And I think that I'm offering this here because essentially what I'm where my independent research started to go after this trip was towards the idea of defending ourselves against violence and what that begins to look like in this world. How is it that we can support our brothers and sisters elsewhere in their defense against what is quite obviously violent? And how can we begin to defend ourselves and really feel in our bodies where this violence is occurring as well, in order to, I suppose, begin to feel that existential crisis before it comes lapping at our shores, and there's very little that we can do about it. And I want to say, yeah, I'm going to move on from violence and self-defense now, but I'm more than willing to talk about this in the Q&A and what this actually looks like, because I do advocate for violent self-defense as well when necessary. We have in every single country around the world, in most countries around the world, we do have provisions for violent self-defense. You are entitled to violently defend your body when that is the only thing that will protect you from harm or from death. And given we are facing the collapse of the biosphere and possibly 4 billion people dead by the end of this century due to our collapsing ecosystems and due to our collapsing economic systems, which will then also trigger political collapses, I think we do need to be talking about what an effective self-defense strategy looks like, because there are billions and billions and billions of bodies on the line. Okay. Has anybody heard of social reproduction theory? No? Right. So I kind of got to this place in my research where I was like, right, there's violence and we need to defend ourselves. And there just seemed to be this other sort of part of it missing, right? About the vision of what we have for the future, kind of what, this community in Colombia were doing, and what are the conditions that we need for life to thrive. It's not just enough to defend life. How do we actually produce more life? How do we keep complexifying the world? And I came across Silvia Federici. Yes, I feel some nodding. Yeah, thank you. She's a goddess. She's an Italian Marxist feminist. She wrote this really astounding book called Caliban and the Witch, which I would highly recommend you all go off and read immediately. Which is essentially tracking, it's a look at how the witch trials in Europe were an active and deliberate undermining of women's political power. And she sort of predates the MAGA slogans and the MAGA strategy by 10 years. She wrote this, about 10 years, a decade before Trump came to power, warning essentially of how patriarchal regimes tend to deliberately extract and oppress women's bodies in order to subjugate their political power. It's a really, really brilliant book. And she belongs to the feminist Marxist group in the 70s and 80s that were writing about social reproduction theory, which is essentially what does a community do in order to reproduce themselves, right? And it's so much more than just this. Like, this is not actually that big a deal when it comes to reproductive labor, the actual producing of new human beings. It's education, it's housing, it's farming, it's weaving baskets, it's storytelling, it's everything that a people need in order to continue their culture, generations and generations beyond themselves. And of course, prior to, our sort of like European, quite gendered, essentialist gendered understanding of sex, everybody did reproductive labor, right? Because everything was reproductive labor. Before you have a wage economy and you have people selling their labor and you have this kind of level of trade, everything everyone does is about the continuation of their community, quite frankly. And my father-in-law is he comes from Samoa, and he is he's essentially an indigenous bloke, although you wouldn't think it now. And he was raised in that community that was still very, very close to how the Polynesians had been living for thousands of years. And in their communities, there was no sort of differential really between the kind of labor that people did, apart from all the men do all of the cooking and cleaning, all of it, everything that we would consider domestic labor, that belongs to the men. And then the women would focus mostly on being with the children and educating the children. And then everyone would do the work associated with everything else, be it farming, be it weaving, be it planting, etc. And so it's been a very interesting kind of base in our household on which to have discussions about how we will do this as we go forward. Because I'm marrying a man essentially who does not come from a culture where that split exists at all. And it's been very healing, I would say, as a feminist to witness that, and very confronting as well as a feminist to recognize how much previously, like, I really did value productive labor over reproductive labor. And I am interested, and I want to throw this out here to you, and I promise this will all come together at the end. This idea that our feminist theory took a wrong turn somewhere, right? Particularly in the 20th century, but equally the feminists, the European feminists that were writing in the 18th and 19th century were upper class women who had access to resources, who typically did not do any reproductive labor, apart from this biological thing that they couldn't really help, right? I'm talking about Mary Wollstonecraft in particular, who wrote a really phenomenal philosophical treatise, but there was very little interest in the reality that somewhere other women were having to do the labor that she didn't have to do and didn't want to do. And equally, when Simone de Beauvoir comes along and sort of continues this tradition with the second sex, has anyone read The Second Sex, The Deuxième Sex? Well, I'm reading it now for my research, and I have to say, boy, that first chapter, it's full of misogyny. Full of misogyny. There's a real sort of hatred and suspicion of the female body, and a desire to disengage from the female body and from female biology, and essentially a yearning, a real longing to belong in the world as a man. And you can understand this at the time. Who wouldn't have wanted to belong in the world as a man then? I mean, they had everything that looked sort of like freedom, and they had power, and they had access. And I think that it's important to like contextualize de Beauvoir in the period that she was writing. Sadly, we've sort of failed to contextualize her in the period that she was writing since then, because this has really informed our feminist discourse in the minority world with regards to how we treat our bodies, the fact that we sort of dematerialize ourselves from them. We're not that interested in them. We're not interested in the connections that they have to our environment, to our like interdependencies. And also the fact that, second wave feminism came along and sort of went, right, well, the path to women's liberation is entry into the productive job market, into the productive economy. And where has that left us? What did that mean? I think it's very interesting that women's liberation came at the time that there was this very cheap influx of goods and labor into Europe because of the neo-colonial economic policies that were essentially creating phenomenally beneficial for Europe and the United States trade deals, essentially, where we were just getting everything really, really, really cheap. And I think that that is related to, quite possibly, and if anyone wants a research question, I'd love for somebody to go off and look at this. But I think that there is also a connection in the end of the slave trade and the discovery of coal, right? I'm very curious in the idea that if we hadn't discovered an even better energy fuel than human labor, than slave labor, would it have ended? Can it end? And I think that this is really important because our economies are predicated on our material footprints, on our material use and our energy use. And since the dawn of capitalism, and since the dawn as well of our other centralizing economic and political forces, the elites don't tend to give up their material resources or their economic resources for moral reasons, right? And then history rewrites it as these moral wins, as this curve of progress that we can identify ourselves with. But I frankly just think that's not the case. If you look at the end of slavery and essentially the Industrial Revolution and the discovery of coal, I mean, they map over each other almost extraordinarily well. And the same again for women's liberation. you had this influx of machines that could do the labor in the house, washing machines, dishwashers, microwaves, and all of this sort of unpaid labor coming in from the UK. It was India and Pakistan. All of this unpaid labor or underpaid labor of women coming in essentially to take up the role so that women could go off and enter the productive economy, right? And I just do not think that that is necessarily a massive win today, not when we are faced with a productive economy that has certain values that are driving the destruction of our natural world and actually our political world as well at this stage and our economic world. And we have absolutely no concept really of what an alternative economy could look like at this stage. There's degrowth, of course, which I think is wonderful, but it is still, and Marxist theory as well, but I kind of differ with the Marxists in that I'm very concerned by still the focus on industry and the focus on enacting this violence somewhere else, somewhere downstream violence will happen. And like, if we go back to what I was saying about the Colombians, who gets to choose where that happens? How do we set the processes up to choose? And really, Fabian and I were talking about this last night. But even if a government steps in, as the Colombian government is now doing in certain places, and offers big financial rewards to indigenous people that are willing to be dispossessed from their lands in order to make the sacrifice to provide the requisite land or resources for renewable energy, how do you put a price on where people have lived for thousands of years, on a land that has informed who they are, has informed their language, has informed their practices? Because people cannot just up and move and drop themselves off somewhere else and maintain themselves, because our practices of reproductive labor and social reproduction are inherently tied to where we are. And I think, frankly, this is glib. There's no research on this, but I do think that there is an element of we lose our minds when we lose our lands, and we lose our language when we lose our lands. I think it's a little bit why everybody in the United States is like a little bit, you know. I think that's relevant. So it's not enough, essentially. I will come to you. It's not enough, essentially, to just offer people new lands or a different way of being, because being takes such a long time to evolve alongside of us, and it's inherently contingent on where we are. I'm gonna wrap us up now. Thank you all for staying with me. I know I'm talking quickly and about a lot of different things. But where I want to get to is, and where I want to offer essentially as this alternative framing as to how we can approach essentially all of the questions that you guys are researching and all of the challenges that we will face over the coming decades, if not centuries. I'm interested in what a reproductive economy looks like. And I very deliberately use the word reproductive rather than regenerative, because I'm interested, what do we need to do to create the conditions for life to thrive? And I'm interested in that as a unifying question. What do we need to do to create the conditions for our lives to thrive on our local level, a community level, political level, economic level, but also the lives of the entire web of life that supports us? And when you begin to consider life as this quite unifying thing that we all are, we're just expressions of, it's difficult to then create a hierarchy upon which you say, well, we'll let this life thrive, and we'll take this life in order to do it. And it creates a process where you're in constant negotiation then with your environment, with your community, with communities elsewhere and with their environments, and recognizing that ultimately we do have to be constrained in some way in order for life to thrive. And that constraint doesn't have to be a negative thing. So I want to leave you with some thoughts by a young Harvard scholar who published a book last year. It's called Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Something. Her name is Alyssa Battistoni. It's a very, 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 very rigorous book. And she has her last chapter on freedom. And she offers this definition of freedom that I think is really quite profound in a day and age where freedom is often touted as either this sort of unlimited access to whatever we want, or is also sort of by the climate doomer crowd spoken of as something that will have to be lost to history, right? And that we will have to return to this idea of primitivism. Alyssa Battistoni says that our freedom is inherently constrained by and contingent upon the earth. We are fundamentally connected to our environment. We are constrained by the reality of that environment. And yet also being in that environment is what allows, in particular, human beings with our capacity for collaboration, political thought, imaginative thought, to begin to imagine ways to surpass the immediate limits of our environment. And so it's in that dialectic, in that negotiation between seeking to surpass and also seeking to respect the reality and be in the reality of where we are. It's in that constant negotiation that we find our freedom. And that is what we're going to have to do with her, because we cannot extract Earth until there's nothing left of her, evidently. We cannot just go off. Well, I mean, if anybody wants to go off and colonize Mars, write me, let me know how it is. I don't want to. I certainly don't want to do it at the expense of living communities here. And it's also this expression of what it means to be free within a community as well. It offers this way past this very neoliberal libertarian sense of freedom as I do what I want when I want and nothing is allowed to touch me, but rather I want to do what I want, but I also don't want to take from the people that I depend upon because I depend upon them and they depend upon me. So what negotiation can we find here? And in that relationship, in that dialogue, in that negotiation, what other possibilities will emerge between us so that perhaps we can, yes, fulfill the freedom that I want in this moment, but also fulfill their freedom. And in this way, freedom doesn't become a utopic state. It becomes a constant process, something that we are constantly defending and seeking out as well. It's not some revolution that happens that essentially then history writes home about and goes, good job, everyone from the past. It means that it's something that we have to cherish, and it's something that we have to actively commit to, and it's something that we have to actively defend all around the world if we want ours to be defended too. And so for me, an idea or a vision of feminist freedom would be the ability to actively participate in the reproductive labor that needs to happen around the world in order to create the conditions for life to thrive. And that reproductive labor could be supported by a productive economy in some way, right? Because we must still have our medicine, and we must still have our technology, and we must still have our abilities to communicate with one another around the world. But we currently live in a dynamic where it's like this, where all of the free and exploited reproductive labor, exploiting Earth's reproductive carrying capacity, exploiting women's bodies, exploiting the bodies of people of color all around the world, all of that reproductive labor supports this productive economy that does not have values that can support life. And so I think for me, this offers a vision that allows us to not think of abandoning industry and returning to some time in the past, which of course we could never return to anyway, but also offers a collective vision, a unifying vision for social and political and economic innovation that primarily puts life first, and life including us, not just Earth and the bodies of earthly beings as if they were separate to us. And that is what I would like to see more of. I would like to see this reevaluation of our values. And I would like to see it across, of course I get to say that, but I would like to see it across the academy. I would like to see it across our political spectrum. Could we imagine and could we create a world where a productive economy supports a reproductive economy, and the vast majority of the work that we do, the jobs that we create, and the decisions that we make are all about creating the conditions for life to thrive? Because if there was one unifying directive to solving this clusterfuck of a problem, it would probably be, how do we create the conditions for life to thrive? And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Beautiful, thank you. We have some time for questions, thoughts, reflections. Yeah. On the definition of violence,
Sorry?
On the definition of violence that you gave, which I think is beautiful. Like you said, the severing of relationships, it also makes sense that it would then be okay to inflict violence on structures that are not harmful. So I think that's a very good way of framing it. Then what you said later on Marxism, that is still focused on, okay, where to inflict the harm, basically. So like you displaced that. How do you relate those two? Because in violence name, where it would be severing relationships, so you could also have violence, self-defense. Aren't you then again kind of placing harm somewhere else, which is also a critique you have on Marxism?
Yeah, well, so when you look at the legal definition of self-defense, right? Essentially, violent self-defense can only exist as a reaction to violence. There needs to be an original violence there. And so in that manner, I think it's justified as an act of self-defense rather than as an original act of violence. And what I mean by that is like, I always tend to use this example of, say I was attacked. Okay, say I was attacked by somebody bigger than me. Say I was attacked by a man. And I used all of my force to defend myself and ended up killing that man. I'm legally entitled to do that because my inferior strength relative to my attacker means I am less likely to be able to control the situation. And because I cannot control the situation, then the results of the situation are slightly out of my hands. So you can argue legal self-defense, right? And it's how we see battered women's defense being used now all around the world, where women kill their abusers in order to escape. When it's seen as the only method by which you can protect yourself, it is legally justifiable. Now, if my partner is a big rugby player, if he were to use all of his force to kill an attacker, he would not be able to argue self-defense because he has the strength and the capacity to control that situation and to defend himself without causing harm on another. And I think that is really, really, really important because we are at a stage of such political inequality, such material inequality, such economic inequality, and frankly, slightly imaginative inequality as well. And our governments and industry have not been listening to all of the non-violent directives and requests made by the communities around the world, then you do get to a stage where people are left with what option? Exactly. And I do know, even though it's violent self-defense, I do think that it is morally justifiable. And I think even the fact that we have this consensus legally in every country that has essentially was built on British common law, I think as well, shows, and it's a slight hangover from libertarianism, like my body is sacred and nobody can touch it. But I think that it's not an offsetting. It's not an offsetting of violence. It's not in the same way that Marxism essentially goes, yeah, okay, we'll mine over there in order to have this over here for the good of the people. Because it can only respond and it can only exist in relation to violence initially. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a bit garbled, but.
Thank you for the very inspiring talk, but there are a lot of definitions, a lot of concepts you threw at us. But my question is, you have interviewed dozens and dozens of experts from all the different perspectives on climate change, technology, and other aspects. I'm wondering to what extent your background is journalism, right? And journalists tend to operate objectively in the society and do not take sides. And
Says who?
I mean, that's literally literature tells that you have to be objective, you can't take sides, or you can advocate for certain causes.
What literature?
I mean, a lot of journalistic literature, like how we set journalistic norms and journalistic routines and literature around who is a journalist in society as a definition.
Sorry, but having been an academic in journalism, actually, all of the literature shows that journalists are not objective. They are not impartial. And this wedding to impartiality is actually inflicting a real political inability to respond to very obvious moral questions, such as the climate crisis.
Yes, they are not, but they're supposed to be. That's what policy literature suggests. They are not.
I mean,
there are many studies that suggest that. And I do study that too. But my question is, to what extent your own thought process and thinking and kind of your takes have been influenced by the people you've been talking to? And how do you navigate your own identity as a journalist and also being advocate for the causes you care about?
Well, of course I'm influenced. I wouldn't have been able to learn anything if I wasn't able to be influenced. And I would be particularly stupid if I hadn't had used the opportunity to integrate all of this knowledge. I essentially get like a private lecture every week, you know, for an hour. And I think that it is my moral responsibility as a journalist to present my bias, essentially, in every single piece that I write and in the ways that I talk. I'm very, very open about where I sit on the spectrum, what I advocate for. And I think that this idea of like the severing of relationships, frankly, I think that journalism has been a really particularly violent industry as well, in that it has this focus on this impossible thing to attain, impartiality or objectivity, has prevented people from being able to report on their own stories, right? Because they're too close. And so pretending that we can just sort of parachute in and drop ourselves off, and that us being the most removed from the situation will be able to garner the closest and like the most objective analysis of the situation is upside down, inside out, just fucking bullshit as far as I'm concerned. So I have no problems with my bias because my bias comes from expert knowledge, and I'm always willing to update it when confronted with new knowledge. But I would say that it is how do I put this? There is a constant negotiation in myself when I am met with information that doesn't fit my worldview, because I can feel the advocate in me go, oh, there's an element of, well, I don't have to think about that because I am confident that my worldview is like correct. And this is a bump that's difficult. And the journalist in me goes, no, you have to think about it. You have to integrate it. So yeah, there is definitely a personal negotiation.
Rich, when you've spoken about the importance of us having an awareness of violence being visited on communities around the world, understanding that we're always making choices of what violence is happening where, I guess an awareness of that is more plausible if we have some activist spaces talk about the importance of the local connections. Local communities. In my experience, some communities are very good at that, like in XR, it was the International Solidarity Network, groups like Stop the Violent Community Campaign, that's the UK context. That's kind of maybe easier to experience and generate for people who, let's say you live in the UK but have heritage in a different part of the world, and you're kind of people who are part of internationally network, you're part of the local majority. Other activists who maybe don't have just aren't kind of part of those networks in terms of, like, I don't, in that I'm a white British person with heritage in Ireland but not elsewhere in the world, and then it's harder for certainly for those kinds of people to find themselves in those networks. I'm wondering if you have experienced people being able to become part of like global community building that doesn't have to rely on extended kinship networks, something like that. And the other thing on my mind, but I don't know if this is related, so I want to know if you think it's related, whether there's a different kind of work to do, like something around rehoming. I know sometimes we speak about the violence that happened in the UK, for example, like if we think about the Highland clearances, some of this is like awareness of historic violence that has affected communities who might not consider themselves to be part of the local majority. But there are processes there that have affected that, just long-running legacy. So is there like a different kind of work to do about historical awareness, rehoming? Is that
Let me just take that one first, that second one. So when I was in the Kimberley Desert, we were making a film with an Aboriginal community. And I was chatting with some of the women elders, and I told them about the Highland clearances, and they went, "Oh, it happened to you too." And I was astounded by that reaction because for anybody who doesn't know, the Highland Carinthas were really only about 150 years ago when the English went up and like burned the last remaining sort of fierce Scots off of their lands and just moved them off of their lands and took the lands and gave them to the local lords. What happened to the Aboriginals was obviously much, much, much worse, right? It was this extended violence and they were enslaved. And, you know, there's pictures of Aboriginal people in that part of the world from the 50s with collars around their neck, like chains, being marched in chains by these white farmers. And so I hadn't expected that reaction, but they were like, oh, you too. Yeah, it's happened to many of us everywhere, hasn't it? And so I think that there is a really important reframing that needs to happen. And I do like to challenge the sort of like mainstream narrative on colonialism and this like identity of the white man, essentially. Because I'm not too sure who the white man is, really. Because the white man was exploiting other white men for as long as he could, essentially, before going on and exploiting other bodies. So there really is like class solidarity to be built all around the world, and I think it would be extraordinarily helpful. I'm not sure how you do that work. I don't know, but I think it's a very, very obvious, evident thing that needs to be done. And it is challenging because it demands like meeting people in their local contexts, which is perhaps why it hasn't been done. But it is definitely something I would like to see more of. And as for your second question, start local in the UK. You know, like start with those people. I think XR has done really, really, really brilliant work with these kinship networks around the world. And they're very, very good at learning from their elders elsewhere and like allowing for the position of eldership to open up. But if you don't have any immediate way into those networks, then it is important also to be doing the work on the ground where you are, because there's a sort of, over this. It's quite easy to romanticize solidarity. And it's very romantic to go off and meet people from somewhere else that are already involved in the struggle. And it's the coming together of different languages and different cultures and different skin groups and thinking, yes, this is how we're going to rebuild the world. But can you go down the local pub and have a conversation with the guy that wants to vote reform? You know? Because that's essentially what he thinks is his best bet to protect his future. Like, that's where you begin, really. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. So I had one question which relates a bit to previous about communicating uncertainty, because you dropped a couple of facts that to me seemed a little climate doomerist, like the 4 billion people dying at the end of the century, the green transition might create like bigger problems than the current climate problems. I was wondering if, in my perspective, those are quite controversial worst case scenarios, but and maybe you disagree with that, but I think that can also, but then there's also the difference between just dropping those facts and then qualifying the uncertainty around and so on. And yeah, so I think there's a misalignment here, because I would say this is like quite speculative, maybe you disagree, because I didn't hear you qualify this uncertainty around it.
You didn't hear me say could. You didn't hear me say could.
Maybe I heard that, but I still think this is like, 4 billion people dying by the end of the century. It's like an incredibly radical and important idea if that is the case. So like the amount of certainty around it, I think is very important. And I think I missed that being addressed. Like, how certain are we on this?
Well, we're not certain of anything, right? But no idea. Trump could, drop a nuclear bomb on Iran tomorrow and everything could change.
Yeah.
The research that was done that shows that 4 billion people could die by the end of the century if we hit the most catastrophic levels of warming, which could cause this cascading series of collapses through our political spheres, economic spheres, and ecological spheres. That was done by the Faculty of Actuaries in the United Kingdom in tandem with the University of Exeter. And they update this research every year. And we are on track for one of the worst models, essentially. And so that is what they've come out and said, like, this needs to be the top line. We're looking at a 70% reduction in global output, so a collapse of the global economy by 2070, and 4 billion people could be dead as a result by the end of this century.
Sorry, that's only a scenario.
Yeah.
The figure where this 4 billion is stated, it says only illustrative.
What do you mean, only illustrative?
That's what it says, and Roger Helen has promoted this figure as if it is a fact or a prediction.
It is a modeled possibility.
No.
It is, if it is in the paper, it is a modeled possibility. It is, and I've interviewed the lead authors of this paper.
Okay, then I misread the report.
Okay. So they are models, and this is important, and it is also important to remember all models are wrong, some are useful, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not saying 4 billion people will, but we are looking at the really potential rapid destruction of life, including human life, if we do not mitigate warming, and we know that. And I think the fact that this was published by the Faculty of Actuaries, and does everybody know what an actuary is? An actuary, does anybody describe what an actuary? An actuary is the person, a very, very, very well-paid person in a business who defines risk. It's their job to be risk obsessed, you know? So it's pretty astounding research, and they update it every year. What was the other one that you found, the other fact?
So that was more about the cost of the green energy transition.
Yeah.
So the extractivism associated with the batteries and so on.
It could. That was what a report that was written in 2019 said. And there was another report that was written that was published in the end of 2025 that reflected the same research, that if we just continue to uncritically mine the biosphere in order to try to replace our fossil fuel economy with a renewable economy, then we could trigger a biodiversity collapse. Could trigger a biodiversity collapse. It could be worse than the effects of climate change that we're trying to mitigate.
Yeah, I guess for me it just becomes a bit too speculative in a way, because there's also, so many things could happen, but there's also things that are closer to our reality. We know what the current warming is. We know that right now there's increasing extreme weather events around the world. And so
why do you think it's too speculative? France is preparing, the French government is preparing for 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century.
we have, I mean,
just because I think in terms of time, I would want to.
Sorry, yes.
I
Yeah,
would want to give 1 or 2 more people a chance to ask a question. And
Yeah.
And so you, 1 or 2 maybe quick questions answered, so we have a break for the next speaker.
I just want to follow up with what you were asking, because I was thinking when you were talking about it, I agree with you. A lot of things that you said, for example, if you teach to white feminism or European feminism as well, and how usually you create categories, right? And then try to universalize those categories to understand, for example, today, the climate crisis or any other crisis. But then it's again the same, Silvia Derecho is European. And she has also been using examples from other countries who are not her country, for example. And there are some critiques of her work from Silvia Rivera, who's a country, for example, Bolivian scholars saying why we are again having this people from Europe coming here and developing categories of gender, for example, or categories of land, or categories of mestizo, for example, what it means to be mestizo, and bringing to English and then developing this universalizing again ideas. So why do we keep doing this? Coming back to bringing the same languages, the same stories, and the same kind of I have a mess here in my notes, but my question was can also Europe, for example, look at itself without the attempt to universalize things, but also understand itself as a self in itself. that also lives with other categories, with other ways of existing,
Mm.
with other ideas. For example, what Arturo Escobar called the pluriverse, for example, instead of like continue like just developing theory, developing more ideas, like maybe we don't need more European theories and
Mm.
it can just come down a little bit.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, listen, I think Caliban and the Witch is brilliant. She's a European. She wrote about European history.
But let me give you other ones, like Rita Segato, Silvia Winter, Maria Lugones, Concepción Evaristo. They are contemporaneous and even older. So maybe like read those people as well.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
like kind of reclaim ideas that also are using other languages and
Yeah.
that's.
Yeah. I'm a very critical reader, right? So I really enjoyed Silvia Federici. The person she platformed, Veronica Gago, I tried to read that book, couldn't. Just I do not think that it's rigorous scholarship, and I do not think that it's I actually don't see what its value is, quite frankly. So I think what's important to remember, right, is like Silvia Federici has friends. Yeah, she has friends in those countries and she's been invited over. And there really is nothing wrong with being like actively invited by your community and there being like a sort of an international network, if you will, of women working on these things. Like I do think that it's important to not fall prey to only identifying people by where they come from or their skin color or their gender or whatever. I really wish that we could all move past this. By the same token, I'm not at all interested in these conversations that tend to like try to find, universalizing language for gender or for like who fucking cares? People like people will develop in the context in which they develop, and that's fine. I do, however, think that there is a universalizing reality for women, right? And for existing in a female body. And I think, like, I have a book coming out next year about this that is essentially arguing that there is a material connection between the sexual abuse of women and the violence inflicted against planet Earth. And that's because women's bodies are seen as a reproductive resource. And Earth's body is seen as a reproductive resource. And I do think that that is a reality that needs to be considered. And it's a biology that needs to be brought back into feminist discourse because we do exist in bodies. And I think that it's a unifying call for feminism around the world that could then, I mean, the way I go with it in my book is to talk about how understanding how this could then lead to a reproductive economy. But also I agree with you and I would like to take a photo of the names that you've written down of the feminists in your book and I will go away and I will try to read them. Thank you. Thank you for the challenge.
Thank you. From a Marxist lens, imagine people, communities, societies using a form of energy or a form of new technology that would liberate from the old concept of slavery or the contemporary concept of hidden slavery in capitalism. And maybe this is a highly philosophical or maybe highly technical question, but I wonder what this could be and if it's not that intangible.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
I'll rephrase it and maybe I'll...
No, good. Let's talk about it.
So if I understood correctly, you mentioned that in some context we need to work in order to produce things in society, medicine. And if I understood correctly, you mentioned imagine not having to do that in the research of finding new technologies this an answer is leaving all to AI and do all the job for us. So this help us not avoid suppressing classes, suppress the other class of people, suppressing other people. So in this, is this something utopic thing, or is this something that exploring new technologies could indeed direct this? Sorry if it's out of the context that you writing discussed.
No. I'm still not sure if I exactly understand. I'm still not sure. I don't, sorry, maybe my brain is just absolutely free. Anya, do you understand and can you translate? Sorry, this is my friend Anya and she's wonderful and excellent and I often do this to her. Okay. We can discuss it over lunch. I'm really sorry. I'm sorry.
Okay, Stephen, last quick
Yeah.
question and then we'll do a break.
Okay.
So I'm very interested in this question and this concept of the energy transition, energy and kind of the green economy, its impacts and potential for another negative biodiversity mentioned. Is a guy called Michael Thomas. I don't know how reliable this figures are, but he crunched the numbers and said we could run the world economy on 540 times less mining if we move to renewable technologies instead of the current amount of mining we do to run the world on fossil fuels, which I think is like an interesting comparison. Obviously, that's keeping energy levels the same. There's so much opportunity to reduce yesterday. So I like those kinds of sort of also now we crunched them. But I suppose that's just a prelude to a question around mining. It's a big deal in South Africa where I'm from. Every year we have the Africa Mining Endowment in Cape Town. And all the mining execs come and the government is to go and it's always protests. There's the alternative mining endowment. And a question we're wrestling with for a topic on my show that I wrote there is what does good mining look like? Like if we do have to do some mining because we like energy, have you ever seen a good case example in the field or where has it been done well? Where there's not displaced native communities or what's the best case scenario?
Great question. So just to respond to that figure, I don't know that figure. I do know that our overall material footprint would go down if we move to a renewable economy without reducing our energy demands. However, our demand for critical raw materials increases with a renewable economy, and they're the ones that are found in these pristine ecosystems, and that's the problem. I did one town that we went to was a historic mining town that has recently been taken over by a whole sea, I think for a South African conglomerate and then a Canadian conglomerate, these big mining companies. And they were so violent that they actually ended up moving the whole time in order to access deeper into the mountain. But these people, before the mining industry found out about them, had been mining that mountain for 500 years with essentially very minimal ecological damage because their rate of mining was so slow that it was giving to Earth time to heal from the active wounds. And in other places around Colombia, you can sort of see these mountains that have been mined by these artisanal miners. And it's sort of like seeing a mountain with lots of burrows on it. Just these like little entry points and people tunnel in over decades and then they, get to the end. So I think that the scale and the speed at which we do mining is a huge problem. I think if you do on a smaller scale and at a slower speed, then probably, it's definitely not going to be as destructive. But I'm also interested, why do we keep mining living things? Why are we not mining our cities? Why are we not taking all of the cars on the road and melting them down into public transport networks? Why are we not melting down, our financial districts, which are really not doing very much? That's a bit glib, but I mean it. I mean the mass of dead things now outweighs the mass of living things on the planet. Why are we still mining the living things? And I think that is that's for me is an interesting way where like the reproductive economy and the productive economy meet. Where you could have a productive mining economy, but that was with the principles of the reproductive economy. So you're mining that which is dead before you go to mine that which is living. And so I would like to see that kind of conversation and for mining to sort of take that innovative approach. What can we extract from what we have already used essentially? What can we recycle? Yeah, thank you.
I think that's a beautiful word to end.
What can we recycle?